So we're ready to move our two-dimensional diagrams into three-dimensional space. So I made a couple of copies of objects on my diagram, and you'll notice that some of them do not have surfaces. These are simply closed curves, while my rotational clamp, is a surface. And I want to show you how to extrude both types of objects. So right now these objects are grouped. I could ungroup them and select them all, but I can also extrude them as an entire group, and that can be kind of a fast way to get the work done. So I can go to my commands, extrude, and you'll see that it will come up with several different sort of options for extruding, and including extruding a surface. Because I don't have a surface, I'm going to want to extrude a curve. So I'm just going to select that, and look at that. It's already wanting to jump into three-dimensional space. But before you sort of get carried away and click, I want you to look at what some of the menus are telling you about what your options are. So one of them is to assume that the extrusion will become solid. If I turn this off, you can see that now that they're looking a little bit hollow, they're more like cylinders than or sort of open cylinders rather than closed cylinders. But I can also click on solid, and that will cut out a step for me. It'll basically create the surface and then turn these into hollow extrusions. I can also tell it to delete my input. So if I don't want those curves to be remaining on the ground plane that I have started with, I can go ahead and delete the curves on my way there. And that may be something you want to do to keep a clean drawing, or you may want to keep the curves so that if you use them for other items, they are still there. It's also asking me if I want to extrude on both sides. So you'll see this is almost a little bit like that gumball effect, where I'm moving out from the center and I'm moving in both directions. I'm moving above the ground plane and below the ground plane at the same time. But I kind of want to stay on the ground plane, so I'm going to turn both sides off. I'm going to keep it as solid. I also have the option to input a dimension. And remember, we're at 1:1 scale. So let's go ahead and just assume these are, let's call them 1 inch. And I'm going to return, and my extrusion is complete. So worked very well. It's quite nice. I can kind of zoom around and see what those objects are. Now they are actually selectable individually. It ungrouped them. It didn't assume that I wanted to group all of the extrusions. All right, let's do that same set of actions for the surface. I'm going to type in extrude, and this time I'm going to want to pick extrude surface. And I'm going to select my surface and hit enter. And I'm going to tell it that I want this to be 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to return, and there it is. So they still look a little bit different. You can see that this one, if I look over to my properties, is a closed solid poly surface. And if I click on this one, is a closed extrusion. So that's a lightweight extrusion as opposed to this solid object. So we're going to set up the base of our bas relief site, or our low relief site, just using the figure ground. I want this base to be relatively simple. And then as we begin to look at the hierarchical layers in your diagrams, we can choose to interpret those additional figural marks and additional shapes as things which exist upon the low relief site. So let's begin with the bas relief site. We're going to basically have 2 levels for our extrusion. The first will be the figures, and that will be the higher of the 2 levels. We're going to call that 5/8 of an inch. And then the lower part, the ground for the figure, is going to be simply 1/2 of an inch. Now we could make those a lot deeper depending on our objectives. If we were making a drawing and we really wanted a kind of deep base. But in our case, we're going to use these for some future devices to make some of our physical objects. And so we don't want to consume a lot of materials. We're going to make these actually just a little bit smaller for the example. So let's begin by extruding the piece that will be a little bit taller. Okay, so I would like for you to reserve your model at this time so that we can experiment just a little bit more. So, I'm always going to want you to save a copy. So let's just Alt drag over to keep a copy, and now we've got this little one that we can play with.